Millionaire rescues crying homeless girl, then breaks down when he discovers her true identity. In the bustling heart of New York City, where skyscrapers touched the clouds and dreams were born and shattered daily, lived two individuals whose paths were about to intersect in the most unexpected of ways. Alexander Blackwood, a 45-year-old self-made millionaire, had built his fortune through a series of shrewd investments and cutting-edge tech startups. His piercing blue eyes and salt and pepper hair gave him an air of distinguished authority, while his tailored suits spoke of wealth and power. Yet behind the facade of success, Alexander's life was far from perfect. Divorced and estranged from his teenage daughter, he found himself increasingly isolated, his vast penthouse apartment feeling more like a gilded cage with each passing day. On the other side of the city, in the shadows of abandoned buildings and forgotten alleyways, lived Sarah Martinez, a 17-year-old girl with dreams as big as the city itself. Her warm brown eyes and infectious smile belied the hardships she faced daily. Orphaned at a young age and failed by the foster care system, Sarah had been living on the streets for the past 2 years, relying on her wits and the kindness of strangers to survive. Alexander's days were filled with board meetings, charity galas, and the constant pressure to stay ahead in the cutthroat world of business. He had long ago learned to suppress his emotions, seeing them as a weakness in the corporate jungle. His rare moments of joy came from his philanthropic efforts, though even these were carefully calculated for maximum PR benefit. Sarah, despite her circumstances, approached each day with unwavering optimism. She worked odd jobs when she could, saving every penny in hopes of one day affording a small apartment and returning to school. Her evenings were spent in a makeshift shelter she had created in an abandoned subway station, where she would lose herself in secondhand books, dreaming of a better future. As a torrential summer storm descended upon the city, neither Alexander nor Sarah could have imagined how their lives were about to intertwine. The rain pounded the streets, turning the usual cacophony of city noise into a muted roar. It was in this moment of nature's fury that fate would bring these two souls together, setting in motion a chain of events that would challenge their perceptions of the world and themselves. Little did they know that this chance encounter on a rain-soaked street would be the catalyst for profound change, not just in their own lives, but in the lives of countless others. As the storm raged on, the stage was set for a story of compassion, redemption, and the transformative power of human kindness. The day that would change everything started like any other for both Alexander and Sarah. Alexander woke in his luxurious penthouse, the panoramic views of the city obscured by the heavy rain clouds that hung low over the skyline. He sighed, already dreading the day ahead, a series of high-stakes meetings that could make or break his latest venture. As his chauffeur, James, navigated the sleek black Mercedes through the rain-slicked streets, Alexander barely looked up from his phone, firing off emails and reviewing contracts. The world outside the car window was a gray blur, the lives of ordinary New Yorkers as distant to him as another planet. Meanwhile, Sarah's day had started hours earlier. She had risen before dawn, her body aching from another night spent on the hard concrete of her makeshift shelter. The torrential rain had flooded her usual spot, forcing her to seek higher ground. As she trudged through the downpour, her few possessions stuffed into a worn backpack, Sarah tried to maintain her usual optimism, but the relentless rain and growling of her empty stomach made it difficult. By late afternoon, Sarah was exhausted and drenched to the bone. She had been unable to find any work or food, and the shelters were all full due to the storm. Defeated, she slumped against the wall of a building, sliding down to sit on the wet sidewalk. For the first time in years, Sarah felt her resolve crumbling. Tears began to fall, mixing with the rain on her face as she hugged her knees to her chest. It was at this moment that Alexander's car approached. James, the chauffeur, noticed the huddled figure on the sidewalk and began to slow down, but Alexander, engrossed in a heated phone conversation, barked at him to keep driving. They were already late for an important meeting. James hesitated, his conscience warring with his professional duty. "Sir," he interrupted, "I think that person needs help. They look in pretty bad shape." Alexander, irritated by the interruption, glanced out the window. His first instinct was to ignore the situation. He had built his fortune by staying focused on his goals, not getting distracted by others' problems. But something about the sight of the small, shivering figure, alone and in distress, stirred a long, dormant part of his heart. "Stop the car," he said abruptly, ending his call mid-sentence. As James pulled over, Alexander stepped out into the rain, his expensive Italian leather shoes immediately soaked by the puddles. He approached Sarah cautiously, suddenly unsure of himself in a way he hadn't felt in years. "Are you all right?" he asked, having to raise his voice over the pounding rain. Sarah looked up, her face a mixture of fear and hope at seeing someone finally stop to help. I don't know," she managed to say between chattering teeth. Alexander felt a surge of emotion he couldn't quite name. Without thinking, he shrugged off his jacket and draped it over Sarah's shoulders. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's get you out of this rain." As he helped Sarah to her feet, Alexander was struck by how young and vulnerable she looked. "What's your name?" he asked as he guided her towards the car. "Sarah," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah Martinez." "I'm Alexander Blackwood," he responded, opening the car door for her. "Let's get you somewhere warm and dry, and we can figure things out from there." As Sarah hesitated at the door, Alexander saw the fear and uncertainty in her eyes. "It's okay," he reassured her. "I just want to help. No strings attached." Something in his voice must have convinced her, because Sarah nodded and climbed into the back seat of the Mercedes. Alexander joined her, instructing James to drive them home. As the car pulled away from the curb, Alexander found himself staring at the young girl huddled in his jacket. He couldn't remember the last time he had acted so spontaneously, or felt such an immediate need to help someone. It was as if the rain had washed away years of carefully constructed barriers, leaving him exposed to emotions he had long suppressed. Sarah, for her part, was overwhelmed by the sudden turn of events. The warmth of the car and the kindness of this stranger were almost too much to process. She clutched Alexander's jacket tightly around her, afraid that if she let go, she might wake up to find it had all been a dream. As they drove through the rainy streets towards Alexander's penthouse, neither of them could have imagined how this chance encounter would change the course of their lives forever. The storm that had brought them together was just the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything they thought they knew about themselves and the world around them. As Alexander's private elevator ascended to his penthouse, Sarah stood in awe of the luxury surrounding her. The marble floors, the plush carpets, the artwork adorning the walls, it was like stepping into another world. Alexander, watching her reactions, felt a mixture of pride and discomfort. He had grown so accustomed to his wealth that seeing it through Sarah's eyes made him acutely aware of the vast gulf between their lives. Once inside the penthouse, Alexander instructed his housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, to prepare a hot bath and some clean clothes for Sarah. As Sarah was led away, Alexander found himself pacing in his study, trying to make sense of his impulsive actions. What was he doing, bringing a homeless teenager into his home? What would people say? What were the legal implications? His musings were interrupted by Mrs. Chen. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice tinged with concern, "I think you should see this." She led Alexander to the guest bathroom, where Sarah's discarded clothes lay in a heap. Among them was a worn backpack, its contents spilled out on the floor. Alexander's eyes were drawn to a crumpled piece of paper, a hospital discharge form. As he scanned the document, his heart sank. The form revealed that Sarah had been treated for malnutrition and exposure just a week prior. More alarmingly, it indicated that she was a minor and a ward of the state who had run away from her foster home. Alexander felt a wave of conflicting emotions: concern for Sarah's well-being, fear of the legal ramifications of harboring a runaway, and a growing anger at a system that had failed this young girl so badly. His thoughts were interrupted by Sarah's return. Cleaned up and dressed in borrowed clothes that were far too big for her, she looked even younger and more vulnerable than before. The sight stirred something deep within Alexander, a protective instinct he hadn't felt since his daughter was small. "Sarah," he began gently, "I saw your hospital form. I know you're a runaway." Sarah's face fell, fear replacing the tentative hope that had begun to bloom. "Are you going to send me back?" she asked, her voice trembling. Alexander hesitated. The responsible thing would be to contact the authorities immediately. But as he looked at Sarah, remembering the state he had found her in, he couldn't bring himself to make that call. "No," he said finally, surprising even himself. "Not unless you want me to. But I need you to be honest with me. Why did you run away? What happened?" Sarah's story came pouring out. Years of neglect and abuse in the foster care system, bouncing from home to home, never finding stability or love. Her last foster family had been the worst, treating her more like a servant than a child. Running away had seemed like her only option. As Alexander listened, he felt a growing sense of outrage. How could a society that prided itself on its wealth and progress allow children to suffer like this? And how had he, with all his resources and influence, been so blind to these realities? In that moment, Alexander made a decision that would alter the course of both their lives. "Sarah," he said, his voice filled with a determination he hadn't felt in years, "I want to help you, not just for tonight, but for good. If you'll let me, I want to give you a real home, a chance at the life you deserve." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, a mix of disbelief and hope on her face. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why would you do that for me?" Alexander smiled, feeling a warmth in his chest he had almost forgotten. "Because," he said softly, "sometimes life gives us a chance to make a difference, and I think you and I were meant to cross paths for a reason." As they stood there, an unlikely pair, brought together by chance and compassion, both Alexander and Sarah felt the first stirrings of a bond that would change everything. The revelation of Sarah's past and Alexander's decision to help her had set them on a path neither could have anticipated, one that would challenge them both and potentially reshape their understanding of family, purpose, and the true meaning of wealth. Alexander's decision to help Sarah was not one he took lightly. In the days following their chance encounter, he found himself navigating a complex web of legal, ethical, and personal challenges. His first step was to contact his lawyer, explaining the situation and seeking advice on how to proceed. The lawyer's initial response was one of caution. "Alexander," he warned, "harboring a runaway minor is a serious offense. You need to report this to Child Protective Services immediately." But Alexander was adamant. "I can't send her back into a system that's already failed her," he argued. "There has to be another way." After hours of discussion and research, they formulated a plan. Alexander would apply to become Sarah's legal guardian, a process that would require extensive background checks, home studies, and court appearances. It was a long shot, given his status as a single man with no prior fostering experience, but Alexander was determined to try. The consequences of his decision were immediate and far-reaching. Alexander's busy schedule, once filled with business meetings and social engagements, was now dominated by appointments with social workers, court officials, and child advocacy groups. He threw himself into learning everything he could about the foster care system, child psychology, and the unique challenges faced by teenagers who had experienced trauma. His business associates were baffled by his sudden shift in priorities. Board members grumbled about his decreased involvement in day-to-day operations, and competitors began to circle, sensing weakness. Alexander found himself having to delegate more responsibilities to his management team, trusting them to keep the company running while he focused on Sarah's case. The media, always hungry for a story about the rich and powerful, caught wind of the situation. Headlines ranged from heartwarming tales of a millionaire's kindness to scandalous insinuations about his motives. Alexander, who had always carefully cultivated his public image, now found himself at the center of a media storm he couldn't control. But the most profound consequences were personal. As Alexander opened his home and his life to Sarah, he found himself confronting long-buried emotions and unresolved issues from his own past. The walls he had built around his heart began to crumble, forcing him to face the loneliness and disconnection that had characterized his life for so long. His relationship with his own daughter, Olivia, became even more strained. When she learned about Sarah, Olivia was furious. "So you can take in some random street kid, but you couldn't make time for your own daughter?" she lashed out during a heated phone call. Alexander realized that in his quest to help Sarah, he risked alienating Olivia even further. Sarah, for her part, struggled to adjust to her new circumstances. The luxury of Alexander's home was overwhelming, and she often felt out of place and undeserving. Nightmares plagued her sleep, remnants of the trauma she had experienced. There were days when she would retreat into herself, unable to believe that this new life wasn't just a cruel dream she would soon wake up from. Alexander's attempts to connect with her were often awkward and uncertain. He had grown so accustomed to handling everything with cold efficiency that he struggled to provide the emotional support Sarah needed. There were moments of frustration on both sides, times when the gulf between their experiences seemed too vast to bridge. Yet there were also moments of profound connection. The first time Sarah smiled genuinely at one of Alexander's clumsy jokes, he felt a warmth he hadn't experienced in years. When he successfully helped her work through a difficult math problem, the pride in her eyes made all the challenges seem worthwhile. As the weeks turned into months, Alexander's life took on a new rhythm. His mornings, once spent poring over market reports, were now occupied with making breakfast for Sarah and helping her prepare for school. Evenings that had once been filled with business dinners and networking events were now dedicated to homework help and conversations about Sarah's day. The legal battle to become Sarah's guardian was long and arduous. There were setbacks and moments of doubt when Alexander wondered if he had taken on more than he could handle. The scrutiny of his personal life, the invasive questions about his motives, and the constant uncertainty took their toll. But every time he considered giving up, Alexander would remember the sight of Sarah huddled in the rain, or see the hope in her eyes when she talked about her dreams for the future. In those moments, he knew he had to keep fighting. 6 months after that rainy night, Alexander stood before a judge, his heart pounding as he waited to hear the court's decision. Sarah sat beside him, her hand gripping his tightly. As the judge announced that Alexander's petition for guardianship had been approved, the courtroom faded away. All he could see was Sarah's radiant smile and the tears of joy in her eyes. In that moment, Alexander realized that his decision to help Sarah hadn't just changed her life, it had transformed his own in ways he never could have imagined. The consequences of his choice had been profound, challenging him to grow, to open his heart, and to redefine his understanding of success and fulfillment. As they left the courthouse together, no longer just a millionaire and a homeless girl, but a family bound by choice and love, Alexander knew that the real journey was just beginning. The road ahead would not be easy, but for the first time in years, he felt truly alive, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead with Sarah by his side. As Alexander and Sarah adjusted to their new life together, a secondary plot began to unfold, centering around Elena Rodriguez, a dedicated social worker who had been assigned to Sarah's case. Elena, a 38-year-old single mother with a passion for child advocacy, had been working in the foster care system for over a decade, fighting tirelessly to improve the lives of children in her care. When Elena first learned of Sarah's situation with Alexander, she was skeptical. She had seen too many cases where wealthy individuals with good intentions quickly became overwhelmed by the realities of caring for a traumatized child. Her initial meetings with Alexander were tense, filled with probing questions and barely concealed doubts about his motives and capabilities. However, as Elena observed Alexander's genuine commitment to Sarah's well-being and his willingness to learn and adapt, her perspective began to shift. She found herself becoming invested in their success, seeing in their unconventional family unit a potential model for alternative approaches to child welfare. Elena's evolving perspective on Alexander and Sarah's case began to influence her work more broadly. She started questioning some of the long-held practices in the foster care system, wondering if there might be more flexible, individualized approaches to finding permanent homes for children. As she dug deeper into the system's policies and procedures, Elena uncovered a pattern of decisions that prioritized bureaucratic efficiency over the best interests of the children. She began compiling data, documenting cases where strict adherence to rules had led to negative outcomes for foster kids. Meanwhile, Elena's personal life was undergoing its own transformation. Her daughter, Sophia, a bright 16-year-old with a passion for social justice, had become increasingly interested in her mother's work. Inspired by Sarah's story, Sophia started a youth advocacy group at her high school aimed at raising awareness about the challenges faced by kids in the foster care system. Elena found herself navigating a delicate balance between her professional obligations and her growing conviction that the system needed major reform. She began cautiously sharing her findings with trusted colleagues, testing the waters for potential allies in her quest for change. Her efforts didn't go unnoticed. Jonathan Hayes, the newly appointed Director of Child Protective Services, took an interest in Elena's ideas. He saw in her passion and data-driven approach a potential solution to the department's long-standing issues. As Elena's influence grew, so did the resistance from those invested in maintaining the status quo. She faced pushback from colleagues who viewed her proposals as naive or impractical. Anonymous complaints were filed against her, questioning her objectivity and professionalism. The controversy surrounding Elena's work began to intersect with Alexander and Sarah's story in unexpected ways. Alexander, now more aware of the systemic issues within child welfare, offered to use his resources and connections to support Elena's reform efforts. Sarah, grateful for the chance to help other kids like herself, became a powerful voice in Sophia's advocacy group. Elena found herself at the center of a growing movement, balancing her roles as a social worker, a mother, and an emerging leader in child welfare reform. Her journey paralleled Alexander and Sarah's in many ways, as she too faced the challenges and rewards of fighting for change in a system resistant to it. As the secondary plot developed, it became clear that Elena's story was intricately linked with Alexander and Sarah's. Their individual quests for justice and belonging were weaving together into a larger narrative about family, social responsibility, and the power of individuals to effect systemic change. The stage was set for a convergence of these storylines, with Elena's professional crusade and Alexander and Sarah's personal journey poised to create a ripple effect that could transform the lives of countless children in the foster care system. As the months passed, the relationships between Alexander, Sarah, and the other key figures in their lives underwent profound transformations. The initial awkwardness between Alexander and Sarah slowly gave way to a deepening bond of trust and affection. Alexander, who had always prided himself on his self-sufficiency, found himself learning to be vulnerable and emotionally available in ways he never had before. He began to see that his role in Sarah's life wasn't just about providing material comfort, but about offering the emotional support and guidance she desperately needed. One evening, as they sat together working on Sarah's history homework, Alexander shared stories of his own childhood struggles with feeling different and out of place. Sarah, surprised by this glimpse into his past, began to see him not just as her benefactor, but as someone who could truly understand her experiences. "I never thought someone like you could have felt that way," Sarah admitted softly. Alexander smiled, gently squeezing her shoulder. "We all have our battles, Sarah. The important thing is not to fight them alone." These moments of connection became more frequent, building a foundation of mutual understanding and respect. Sarah's nightmares became less frequent, and she began to truly feel at home in Alexander's penthouse. However, their growing closeness also brought challenges. Sarah, still grappling with the trauma of her past, sometimes tested the boundaries of their relationship, pushing Alexander away or acting out in ways that left him feeling helpless and frustrated. During one particularly difficult period, Alexander found himself turning to Elena for guidance. Their relationship, which had started out so adversarial, had evolved into one of mutual respect and collaboration. "It's normal for her to push back," Elena reassured him during a late-night phone call. "She's testing to see if you'll abandon her like others have. The key is to remain consistent and patient." Elena's support became invaluable to Alexander, and he found in her a friend and ally in navigating the complexities of parenting a traumatized teenager. Their shared commitment to Sarah's well-being formed the basis of a deep and lasting friendship. Sarah, too, found herself forming unexpected connections. Her friendship with Elena's daughter, Sophia, blossomed as they worked together on the youth advocacy group. For the first time, Sarah had a peer who could relate to her passion for social justice and her desire to help other kids in the system. Perhaps the most challenging relationship development was between Alexander and his daughter Olivia. The tension between them had reached a breaking point, with Olivia refusing to speak to her father for weeks after learning about Sarah. It was Sarah who finally broke the impasse. Sensing Alexander's pain over the estrangement, she took it upon herself to reach out to Olivia. "I know you're angry with your dad," Sarah wrote in a heartfelt email, "but please don't punish him for trying to help me. He talks about you all the time, and I know he loves you so much." Sarah's words seemed to touch something in Olivia. Slowly, cautiously, she began to reconnect with her father. Their first meeting, a tense dinner with Sarah present, was awkward, but marked the beginning of a healing process. As Alexander worked to rebuild his relationship with Olivia, he found that the skills he was learning with Sarah, patience, active listening, emotional openness, were helping him become a better father to his biological daughter as well. The web of relationships continued to expand and evolve. Alexander's business associates, initially skeptical of his new priorities, began to see the positive changes in him. Some even became involved in his efforts to reform the foster care system, lending their expertise and resources to the cause. Elena's relationship with her superiors and colleagues shifted as her reform efforts gained traction. While some resented her for rocking the boat, others were inspired by her dedication and began to rally around her vision for change. Through it all, the core relationship between Alexander and Sarah remained the heart of the story. Each day brought new challenges and discoveries as they navigated their unique family dynamic. There were arguments and misunderstandings, moments of doubt and frustration, but there was also laughter, joy, and a growing sense of belonging. 1 year after that rainy night, when their paths first crossed, Alexander and Sarah celebrated her adoption becoming official. As they stood before the judge, surrounded by their newfound family, Alina, Sophia, Olivia, and others who had become part of their journey, both felt a profound sense of gratitude for the relationships that had blossomed from their chance encounter. The bonds they had formed, tested by adversity and strengthened by shared purpose, had transformed not just their lives, but the lives of those around them. As they left the courthouse, hand in hand, both Alexander and Sarah knew that their story was far from over. The relationships they had cultivated would continue to grow and evolve, shaping their future in ways they had yet to imagine. The day of the state child welfare reform hearing arrived, bringing with it a tension that hung over the city like a storm cloud. The courthouse steps were crowded with protesters, supporters, and media from across the nation, all eager to witness what had become one of the most high-profile child welfare cases in recent memory. Inside the packed courtroom, Alexander sat with Sarah by his side, both of them dressed in their best attire. Elena was nearby, surrounded by stacks of documents and data that represented months of tireless work. The air was thick with anticipation as the committee members took their seats. As the hearing began, various experts and officials presented their testimonies. Some defended the current system, citing budget constraints and the complexities of child welfare. Others, aligned with Elena's research, argued passionately for comprehensive reform. The turning point came when it was Sarah's turn to speak. As she approached the podium, a hush fell over the room. This was the moment many had been waiting for. The voice of a child who had lived through the system. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the microphone, but her voice was clear and strong. "My name is Sarah Martinez," she began, "and until a year ago I was just another statistic in the foster care system." She recounted her experiences, the abuse, the neglect, the feeling of being lost in a system that was supposed to protect her. But then she spoke of hope, of the second chance she had been given, and of her dream to see other children have the same opportunity. "I stand here today not just for myself," Sarah said, her voice gaining strength, "but for every child who has ever felt forgotten or unloved. We deserve better. We deserve a system that sees us as individuals, not case numbers." As Sarah spoke, many in the room were visibly moved. Committee members who had seemed disinterested earlier now leaned forward, hanging on her every word. Alexander watched with a mixture of pride and awe, amazed at the poised young woman his once timid ward had become. Just as it seemed Sarah's testimony had swayed the committee, an unexpected challenge arose. A senior official from the Child Welfare Department stood up, questioning the legitimacy of Sarah's adoption and insinuating that Alexander's wealth had allowed him to circumvent proper procedures. The room erupted into chaos. Shouts and arguments broke out as the committee struggled to maintain order. Alexander felt a moment of panic, fearing that everything they had worked for was about to unravel. It was Elena who turned the tide. Armed with her meticulous research and years of experience, she systematically dismantled the officials' accusations. She presented evidence of how Alexander and Sarah's case, far from being an exception, could serve as a model for a more flexible and effective approach to child placement. What we're proposing, Elena argued passionately, is not to abolish the system, but to evolve it. To create a child welfare program that truly puts the well-being of children first. As Elena concluded her presentation, laying out a comprehensive plan for reform, the mood in the room shifted. Committee members who had been skeptical now nodded in agreement. Even some of the staunchest defenders of the status quo seemed to be reconsidering their positions. The climactic moment came when the committee chair called for a vote on whether to recommend Elena's reform proposal for full legislative consideration. As the votes were tallied, Alexander gripped Sarah's hand tightly. Elena held her breath, years of work hanging in the balance. The committee votes in favor of the proposal, the chair announced, his voice ringing through the suddenly silent room. We will recommend full consideration of the Child Welfare Reform Act. The courtroom erupted in cheers and applause. Sarah threw her arms around Alexander, both of them teary-eyed. Elena was swarmed by supporters and colleagues, all celebrating this monumental step towards change. As the noise of celebration washed over them, Alexander, Sarah, and Elena shared a look of triumph and gratitude. They had faced their greatest challenge and emerged victorious, not just for themselves, but for countless children who would benefit from their efforts. The climactic hearing had not just been about winning a vote. It represented the culmination of their personal journeys and the beginning of a new chapter in child welfare reform. As they left the courtroom, surrounded by well-wishers and reporters, all three knew that while the battle was not over, they had taken a giant leap towards creating real, lasting change. In the wake of the successful hearing, Alexander, Sarah, and Elena found themselves at the center of a whirlwind of activity. The recommendation to consider the Child Welfare Reform Act had opened doors, but it had also intensified the challenges they faced. Now, they had to navigate the complex process of turning their proposal into actual legislation. Alexander, drawing on his years of business negotiations, took the lead in political outreach. He arranged meetings with key lawmakers, using his influence and resources to ensure their reform ideas were heard by those with the power to enact them. However, he quickly discovered that the world of politics was far different from the business arena he was accustomed to. It's not just about presenting a good plan, he confided to Elena after a particularly frustrating meeting with a senior senator. There are so many competing interests, so many hands out for favors. How do we cut through all that? Elena, with her years of experience in the system, provided crucial insights. We need to build a coalition, she explained. It's not enough to have a good idea. We need to show how this benefits everyone, the children, the foster families, even the bureaucrats worried about their jobs. Together, they began to craft a strategy that addressed the concerns of various stakeholders. They reached out to foster parent associations, child psychologists, education experts, and even fiscal conservatives who saw the long-term economic benefits of a more effective child welfare system. Sarah, despite her youth, played a vital role in these efforts. Her powerful testimony at the hearing had made her a symbol of the need for reform. She began speaking at community events and to youth groups, putting a human face on the statistics and policy proposals. However, their efforts to resolve the conflicts inherent in reforming such a massive system were met with significant resistance. Entrenched bureaucrats fought to protect their positions. Some foster care providers, fearing increased oversight, lobbied against the proposed changes. Conservative groups raised concerns about government overreach into family matters. The media attention, initially a boon to their cause, became a double-edged sword. While it helped spread awareness of the issues, It also made Alexander, Sarah, and Elena targets for those opposed to their efforts. They faced personal attacks, accusations of hidden agendas, and attempts to discredit their motivations. One particularly challenging moment came when a tabloid published a sensationalized story questioning the nature of Alexander and Sarah's relationship. The implication of impropriety was devastating, threatening to undermine everything they had worked for. "Maybe this was a mistake," Sarah said tearfully one evening, after another day of fending off reporters and angry phone calls. "Maybe I should just go back to being invisible." Alexander, his own doubts weighing heavily on him, found the strength to reassure her. "No, Sarah, we can't give up now. What we're doing is too important. We knew it wouldn't be easy, but we have to keep fighting." Elena, ever the voice of reason and strategy, proposed a bold move. "We need to go on the offensive," she said. "Instead of just reacting to these attacks, let's take control of the narrative. Let's show people the real impact of what we're trying to do." Taking her advice to heart, they organized a series of public forums across the state. These events brought together former foster children, successful adoptive families, and child welfare experts to share their stories and explain the need for reform. They invited their critics to attend, offering an open dialogue rather than a confrontation. Slowly but surely, their persistent efforts began to pay off. Public opinion started to shift in their favor. Lawmakers who had been on the fence began to express support for the Reform Act. Even some former opponents, seeing the growing momentum, reached out to negotiate compromises. A breakthrough came when they managed to secure the support of a bipartisan group of legislators. This coalition, drawn together by the undeniable need for change and the compelling vision presented by Alexander, Sarah, and Elena, became the driving force behind the Reform Act in the state legislature. As the bill moved through committees and debates, Alexander, Sarah, and Elena worked tirelessly to address concerns, clarify provisions, and rally support. They spent long nights refining language, early mornings in strategy sessions, and countless hours meeting with anyone who could influence the outcome. Their efforts to resolve conflicts extended beyond just the legislative process. Alexander worked to mend his relationship with his daughter Olivia, involving her in the reform efforts and showing her how their family's personal journey was part of a larger mission. Elena navigated the tricky waters of her professional life, balancing her role as an advocate for change with her responsibilities within the existing system. Sarah, in perhaps the most profound act of conflict resolution, reached out to her former foster families. While some meetings were tense and emotional, others led to healing and understanding. These conversations not only helped Sarah process her own past, but also provided valuable insights that were incorporated into the reform proposals. As the final vote on the Child Welfare Reform Act approached, Alexander, Sarah, and Elena knew that regardless of the outcome, their attempts at conflict resolution had already created significant change. They had brought together diverse groups, challenged entrenched systems, and opened up difficult but necessary conversations about how society cares for its most vulnerable members. The night before the vote, as they gathered in Alexander's penthouse for a quiet dinner, there was a sense of nervous anticipation, but also of pride in how far they had come. They had faced seemingly insurmountable conflicts and worked tirelessly to find resolutions, not just for themselves, but for countless children who would be impacted by their efforts. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Elena said, raising her glass in a toast, "we've already won. We've shown that change is possible when people come together for a common cause." Alexander and Sarah nodded in agreement, clinking their glasses together. They knew that the journey wasn't over, that there would be more conflicts to resolve and challenges to face. But in that moment, they felt ready for whatever lay ahead, strengthened by the bonds they had formed and the purpose that united them. The passing of the Child Welfare Reform Act marked a significant turning point, not just for the foster care system, but for Alexander, Sarah, and Elena personally. As they stood in the gallery of the state capitol, watching the final vote tally appear on the board, a wave of emotions washed over them: joy, relief, and a profound sense of accomplishment. The act's passage was more than a legislative victory. It was a validation of their efforts and a catalyst for change. As the implications of their success sank in, each of them found themselves at a crossroads, facing new opportunities and challenges. Alexander, energized by the impact he had made outside the business world, decided to step back from his corporate role. He announced his intention to create a foundation dedicated to child welfare and education initiatives. "This journey has shown me that true wealth isn't just about money," he told the press. "It's about the positive change we can create in people's lives." Sarah, now on the cusp of adulthood, felt a calling to continue advocating for foster children. With Alexander's support, she decided to defer her college plans for a year to travel the country, speaking about her experiences and the importance of reform. Her story had become a powerful tool for change, and she was determined to use it to help others. Alina found herself at a professional crossroads. Her role in shaping the Reform Act had gained her national recognition, and she received offers to lead child welfare departments in other states. After much consideration, she chose to stay in her current position, believing she could do the most good by implementing the reforms she had helped create. The success of the Reform Act also opened new doors for collaboration. Government agencies, nonprofits, and even private sector companies reached out, eager to be part of the change. Alexander, Sarah, and Elena found themselves at the center of a growing movement, with opportunities to influence child welfare policies beyond their state. As they charted their new directions, the three remained closely connected, their bond strengthened by their shared accomplishment. They formed an informal advisory council, meeting regularly to discuss ongoing initiatives and support each other's efforts. This turning point also brought personal transformations. Alexander, once defined by his corporate success, now found greater fulfillment in his philanthropic work. Sarah, no longer defined by her past trauma, embraced her role as a leader and inspiration to others. Elena, previously constrained by bureaucratic limitations, now had the platform to enact real systemic change. As they looked to the future, all three felt a mix of excitement and trepidation. The path ahead was uncertain, but they were united in their commitment to building on their success and continuing to fight for vulnerable children. The passing of the Reform Act wasn't an endpoint, but rather the beginning of a new chapter in their ongoing journey to transform lives and systems. In the months following the passage of the Child Welfare Reform Act, Alexander, Sarah, and Alina found themselves reflecting on their incredible journey and the profound ways in which it had changed them. Alexander, sitting in his new foundation's office, marveled at how different his life had become. The man who had once measured his worth by the size of his bank account now found his greatest joy in the stories of children whose lives had been improved by the reforms. He thought back to that rainy night when he first met Sarah, realizing how close he had come to driving past and missing out on the most transformative experience of his life. "I thought I was rescuing her," he confided to Elena during one of their regular catch-up calls. "But in reality, Sarah saved me. She gave me purpose, showed me what really matters in life." Sarah, traveling the country as an advocate for foster children, bloomed with newfound confidence and purpose. The scared, distrustful girl who had huddled in the rain was now a poised young woman, captivating audiences with her story and inspiring change. During a particularly moving speech to a group of foster parents, Sarah realized how far she had come. "A year ago, I couldn't imagine trusting anyone," she told the group, her voice strong and clear. "Now, I have a family, a purpose, and hope for the future. Every child deserves that chance." Alina, implementing the reforms she had helped create, found herself growing into a leadership role she had never anticipated. The frustrations that had once nearly driven her from her job were now challenges she faced with determination and creativity. She reflected on how her perspective had shifted, from feeling powerless within the system to being an agent of change. "I used to think one person couldn't make a difference," she told her daughter Sophia, who was now considering a career in social work. "But our journey showed me that when passionate people come together, real change is possible." The growth they experienced wasn't just individual, their relationships had evolved as well. Alexander and Sarah's bond had deepened into a true father-daughter relationship built on mutual respect and shared experiences. Alexander's relationship with his biological daughter, Olivia, had also healed and strengthened, with Olivia becoming actively involved in the Foundation's work. Sarah and Sophia's friendship had blossomed, with the two young women supporting each other's aspirations and activism. Elena found that her collegial relationship with Alexander had grown into a deep friendship, with both of them valuing the other's perspective and support. As they reflected on their journey, each of them recognized how their experiences had reshaped their worldviews and priorities. Alexander, once driven by profit and personal gain, now measured his success by the positive impact he could make. Sarah, who had once seen herself as a victim of circumstance, now embraced her power to shape her own destiny and help others. Elena, previously constrained by the system she worked in, had become a visionary leader, unafraid to challenge the status quo. They also acknowledged the challenges they had faced and overcome: the public scrutiny, the political battles, the personal doubts and fears. These trials had tested them, but also strengthened their resolve and deepened their commitment to their cause. As they looked to the future, all three felt a sense of cautious optimism. They knew that their work was far from over, that there would be new challenges to face and obstacles to overcome. But they also knew that they had grown into individuals capable of meeting those challenges head-on, armed with experience, passion, and an unshakable belief in the power of compassion and perseverance to change lives. The growth they had undergone, both individually and as a unit, had not just changed their own lives, but had set in motion changes that would impact countless others. As they continued their work, they carried with them the lessons learned, the strengths gained, and the unbreakable bonds forged in the crucible of their shared journey. As the sun set on another day of tireless work towards improving the lives of vulnerable children, Alexander, Sarah, and Elena gathered on the balcony of the Foundation's office. The city sprawled below them, a tapestry of lights and lives, each with its own story of struggle and hope. Alexander, his arm around Sarah's shoulders, spoke softly. "You know, when I first brought you home that rainy night, I never imagined where it would lead us." Sarah nodded, her eyes bright with emotion. "It's amazing how one act of kindness can change everything." Elena, leaning against the railing, added, "And how that change can ripple out to touch so many lives." Their journey had embodied the themes that now defined their work and their lives: the transformative power of compassion, the strength found in unlikely connections, and the ability of individuals to effect systemic change. As they stood there, united by their shared experiences and common purpose, they reaffirmed their commitment to the cause that had brought them together. They knew that there would be more challenges ahead, more lives to touch, more systems to reform. But they also knew that they were no longer alone in their fight. Their story had inspired others, creating a movement that continued to grow and evolve. "We've come so far," Sarah mused, "but in many ways it feels like we're just getting started." Alexander and Elena nodded in agreement. The work they had begun, the lives they had touched, the changes they had set in motion, would continue long into the future. Their journey, born from a chance encounter on a rainy night, had become a beacon of hope, a testament to the enduring power of kindness, perseverance, and the unbreakable bonds of chosen family. As night fell over the city, the three of them stood together, ready to face whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, united in their commitment to creating a world where every child had the chance to thrive.